Hello, everybody. My name is Kathryn Florence. I am a settler scholar currently living in Carmel. I have a background in archaeology, anthropology, and art history, and I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Miami Nation covered by Session 71. Today is home to a diverse population of other peoples. I respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Bloomington and IU community. I start with this land acknowledgement not out of habit or procedure, but out of awareness. It is as much to unsettle myself as it is to reinsert a presence that has been erased through the tides of colonialism. This conference asked us to look at the hidden, the lost, and obscured histories of Indiana. And to me, the most obvious place to start was with the removal of Indians from the land of the Indians. Look, I told you, I went into art history. I don't know technology. So it's June, and the intern is in its natural habitat at the Tippecanoe County Historical Association. It has an odd appearance consisting of approximately 1 pen, 2 pencils, a fine hair paintbrush on it at all times, usually a few perched behind the ears, and the rest stuck into her ponytail like a pincushion. Add in a match of cotton and non-latex gloved with a measuring tape hanging off her hip. Its behavior consists of scurrying through the halls of the hanging storage to the front desk, taking measurements of paintings, inputting the data into the computer, cleaning away the dust, and then ushering the painting back and repeating the procedure. I had been out of university for about 2 months now with my bachelor's, and it was during that internship when I was first introduced to the artist George Winter, which took the staff by surprise given my focus on Indigenous arts. It wasn't a secret, but it wasn't exactly taught in detail throughout our courses at Purdue University. George Winter is heralded as Indiana's first professional artist. He was an English settler-immigrant who moved to the Wabash River in 1830, and in that same year, the federal government enacted forced removals of the indigenous nations in the territory, newly demarcated reservations of Oklahoma. Part of this trail of death would be documented by Winter himself through letters, journals, and his paintings. This paper specifically addresses how these paintings of the Potawatomi presented Indiana as an uninhabited landscape, ripe with untouched beauty despite simultaneously painting countless portraits of the very people who lived there. I propose a reevaluation of the role of Winter's paintings played in the creation of Indiana's image as a frontier. Moreover, how these images curated a distinctly romanticized vision of the forced relocation of Potawatomi as a regal exodus, even as dislocation. Such 19th century imaginaries assisted in downplaying the atrocity of the genocidal policy and the narrative of Indiana's colonization and the relationship settlers had with the stewards of this land. Winter not only shaped how his contemporaries envisioned the territory, but also how we imagine the landscape today, through the immediate and lasting effects of imagining the land of Indians without Indians. So, quick background time. The Potawatomi are an ethnic group of Algonquin-speaking First Nations. They call themselves the Anishinaabe, the original people. That irony will not be lost. They follow the Dudem system, which means they identified through clanship. And they were also mobile like the Miami neighbors, shifting between sedentary summer villages and smaller distributed winter camps. As John P. Bowes explains, there was, quote, no single Potawatomi nation existing in the 1830s or at any other previous time in history. By the 1830s, Potawatomi bands encompassing approximately 6,000 individuals lived along the rivers and lakes of present-day Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Illinois. Overlapping band affiliations as well as general mobility made it difficult for governing agents to count and label the disparate bands, end quote. These autonomous bands grouped together into villages around a leader, a Wakamek, and today we're going to be focusing specifically on Menonomi's band of Potawatomi that was later identified as the Yellow River Potawatomi, because that's the nearest landmark they lived next to. So, yeah, guess what, everybody? Time to talk about colonialism. Dispossession, dislocation, and deportation were not new experiences in the 19th century. It was a continuation of policies that had actually began 2 centuries prior. The population of white settlers was increasing exponentially. North of the Wabash River, the population went from around 3,300 in 1830 to around 65,000 in 1840. These settlers wanted land and saw it as their right through the doctrine of discovery, which, quote, declared that European Christians acquired the permanent and undisputed title to any land not claimed previously by another European country. The one defect to immediate and full transfer of unencumbered title to the American government was a small right, in quotes, retained by Indigenous people under the legal fiction, the right to occupy their own lands until they voluntarily relinquished them in formal agreement with the United States, end quote. The government at the state and federal level then began writing treaties to bring about these acquisitions. And despite 19 treaties being negotiated with Potawatomi agents for reservation land east of the Mississippi, these 4 acts were responsible for the removal of them west of the Mississippi. Please note that these were legal and, at the same time, illegal. Which brings us to August of 1838. So after the Yellow River Potawatomi refused to vacate the land as stipulated by these treaties, white settlers decided to move on to the land anyway, and this instigated hostilities. As these erupted, Senator John C. Tipton and Governor David Wallace authorized their removal. So on September 4th, 1838, an estimated 1,500 Potawatomi were lined up by military agents led by Tipton. 859 individuals were recorded, with the terminal, elderly, and sick left behind. And so they marched, quote, all heavily guarded with a lot of guards at the rear with bayonets, which were often used to keep the weak ones in the procession. Before starting, the torch was applied to their village so that they might see their homes destroyed and they would not want to return, end quote. Yes, in comparison to the Cherokee Trail of Tears, which occurred at the same time and saw the death of 4,000 of an estimated 16,000 immigrants. 40 victims seems to be rather conservative. But this is not a statistics question. This is a matter of human life, and just one casualty was one too many. Across the Atlantic, this man was born. He studied art in London before immigrating to the States, where he set his sights upon Indiana. According to art historian Mary Q. Bennett, quote, he became so interested in the Indians and their manner of living that he gave up all the comforts of the East and came into their midst, enduring many deprivations of the pioneer life on the frontier, that he might study their character, costume, and life of the red men in their native environment, end quote. We're going to take this description with a grain of salt because she was writing in 1921. Now, it might seem odd to talk about art when the subject of this panel is about land. I'm getting there, don't worry. So as I have said in just about every talk I have given, art is not, nor has it ever been, a passive reflection of a society's aesthetic values. It is an active agent in constructing and contesting a network of culture and societal narrative it depicts. What we read out of art informs how we understand the world, what we believe exists within it, and where we orient ourselves in relation to what is depicted. The works of George Winter provide more than a glimpse of settler colonialist perceptions of the Potawatomi, because it illuminates a narrative of framework about race, nature, and belonging that pervaded throughout the Romantic period and the Jacksonian era. So, for those that aren't art historians, when I say the Romantic period, I don't mean the honeymoon phase of a relationship. I'm talking about an art period beginning at the close of the 18th century that goes into the late 19th. This style is defined by humanist philosophy, empire building, and contemplating the human relationship with nature. So, we see these trends in America often through landscapes that both colonize the land through the artist's gaze and by capturing it on canvas. It gave rise to the adventure artist who explored Africa, Asia, Oceania, Antarctica, and the Americas, and even the remote parts of Europe, and then brought these visions back of exotic peoples and locales for local consumption. So these paintings on screen are the ones by Winter. They're currently held at the IMA. You can see how the features of the landscape readily dwarf the very people that are in it, as well as basically giving more attention to the nature around the people depicted than to the people themselves. I mean, look at those boulders. Those are nice boulders, and yet the people themselves are depicted very small with little detail. As one scholar wrote in the history bulletin, their beautiful color studies, Indian costumes of that day, and their rich riot of hues and fineries furnished by the traders, making rarely picturesque subjects. Some of these are Indian chiefs, prominent in their day, but now lost to memory. End quote. So what we see in these pictures is a space that should be filled, a sentence cut off mid-word, a specter that refuses to be exorcised. This presence of absence is a peculiar thing to define because it requires us to be looking for what isn't there. Falzetti warns that in the archive, absences also demand to be theorized. The absence of Indigenous histories is as central to the violence of settler colonialism as is the absence of Indigenous bodies, end quote. And following this observation, I want to talk about what Winter doesn't show in his oeuvre, as well as the trope he does, that of the vanishing Indian. The visual cues he uses erases Indigenous presence on the land, obscure the violence against the Potawatomi, and prescribe colonist narratives that naturalizes the settler. The trail he presents is a carefully constructed image built upon assumptions and intentions that must be interrogated, especially in his oil paintings, which he transfers to canvas his own mental visions of ideal landscapes. So, yeah, that's right, everybody, it's colonialism again. Winter's depictions played upon the settler imaginary of the West, the frontier, and the First Nations that lived there. The Romantic, note the capital R, we're talking about the art period, culture idealized Indigenous persons as very much connected to nature, noble yet savage, wild, uniquely American as opposed to the European heritage that preceded the century, and lastly, endangered. Removal legislation was accepted because it was believed that it would protect the Indigenous people from the inevitable extinction at the hands of progress and white superiority. Removing them to reservations was going to provide a means to preserve them for just a little bit longer. I will admit that salvage anthropology had its problems, but at least we weren't romantics in this sense. But in essence, that was what Winter sought to do with his art. He wanted to preserve the image of the Potawatomi as they were being forcefully removed from their home. Frequently, Winter depicts small groups and individual portraits of the Potawatomi. These people are dressed in vibrant shawls, bold skirts, and shining silver. And noted Indigenous historian Susan Sleeper Smith found that Winter's sketches illustrate the incorporation of cloth and adornments from trade and with settlers through the posts that dotted the riverways that crossed Indiana. This adaptation was what some white settlers sought to halt through removal. It's in these sketches he emphasizes these items instead as Indigenous markers, diminishing their European origin. And I also want to highlight how in these pictures, Winter removes his subjects from the land. These scenes rarely feature recognizable landmarks. Even if it is just a tree, it's hard to tell one tree from, well, basically any other tree. They can't be located within a known landscape. They can't be pinned down to a specific site. They exist outside of here. They exist elsewhere. And this leaves Indiana as basically uninhabited, wiped of any Indigenous history. And moreover, by only showing these small, isolated groups, he obscures the actual nature of the trail. When we look at these camp scenes, they're small, they're transient, temporary. These are people on the move, and yet, where are their belongings? If they're being emigrated? Where are their possessions? This could easily just be seen as a Sunday jaunt, not an exodus. He is documenting the removal, and yet we don't see it in these images. We see something more peaceful than it actually was. This is one of the few sketches he actually did of the procession along the Trail of Death. William Polk, one of the military personnel responsible for the escort, described it as, quote, pleasantest and happiest of the emigration's rest, end quote. This is the image that Winter curates for his audience. You really have to be looking for it to see the guns, see the bent backs, and to see the sorrow. It was not antiseptic. It was not clean. In all cases, it involved some manner of coercion. Removal forcefully renamed the physical landscape and cultural landscape as it marginalized native ways of living and being. Just as the Trail of Death erased the Potawatomi from Indiana, so too did Winter's paintings erase the reality of the Trail of Death. This perpetuates the epistemological framework that justified settler occupation of the land in the North. George Winter painted a precise vision of the Potawatomi as being an exodus to the reservation, land promised by the United States governments. And yet his works belie the story of lands also promised to settlers, land already occupied, but whose stewards were removed and presented as untouched wilderness in their stead. This was not a promised land, but a land of broken promises. Thank you.